Hey everybody, welcome to Mossback, the official podcast of the Mossback's Northwest video series from Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg.
And I'm Knut Berger.
And today, we've got something a little spooky for you. A trio of ghastly tales involving murder and mystery from the Pacific Northwest. More specifically, some very strange things that have happened here to bodies after death. From a corpse turning to soap to floating feet. This is the episode you've been waiting for. Mossback Goes True Crime. Although it's not all about crime, it definitely calls for detective diligence. If you haven't already seen the video, take a few moments to watch it. It's a great companion to this conversation, with plenty of historic images that might intrigue you too. You can find the video in the show notes, but for now, lend us your ears and maybe more. Knut, one of my favorite and most relaxing pastimes is to curl up with a good crime whodunit. The pulpier, the better, whether it's true crime or mysteries. I really like Walter Mosley and Michael Connelly for crime fiction like the Harry Bosch series. But I've never read any Seattle mysteries or crime novels. How about you?
I've avoided all the local stuff.
Why?
Because I think I'd be too critical of it. I'd be looking at, that's not quite right, that location, or I would have described that differently.
Oh, accuracy.
And also your own kind of writer mentality, wanting to get in there and be editor, critic. I also like a good crime novel, but I prefer them to happen in places I don't know much about.
Well, some of the Mossback's Northwest stories in the video series that we've worked on together certainly involved dastardly deeds, right?
That's true. Yeah, we've had some good crime stories. Harry Tracy, the outlaw.
Right.
Harry Tracy was a bad man. He was a Northwest outlaw, and a manhunt for him spawned sensational national headlines and thrilling dime novels.
He was a piece of work. And Ted Bundy?
One of the most infamous serial killers of all time, Ted Bundy.
You can't really talk about Northwest crime without a serial killer touchstone of some kind. We did D.B. Cooper.
Right.
One of the Northwest's greatest mysteries is about a skyjacker who called himself Dan Cooper.
Which is, an unsolved Northwest crime.
Crime that everybody still loves.
Yeah. If we put D.B. Cooper in the title of this podcast, we'd probably get 5 times the listeners.
So the title of the Mossback's Northwest episode that we are kind of talking around and about today was 3 Problem Bodies, which seems to be a play on a science fiction series. Is that right?
Yeah, we were streaming and airing a science fiction series called The 3 Body Problem. It was a big hit as a book and as there was a Chinese version and then an English language version. Anyway, but when I did this story, I called it The 3 Problem Bodies.
So let's just start with one of those problems. You call this story The Lady of the Lake. Who was the Lady of the Lake and what happened here?
So the Lady of the Lake is about a crime that was committed on the Olympic Peninsula in the 1930s. And I first heard about it from my father, who had been in the logging business on the Olympic Peninsula and knew that area very well and had just, talked about what it was like. And there was a case that popped up literally in the early 1940s. And it was a body that floated to the surface of Lake Crescent. And the body had been wrapped in blankets and tied with a hemp rope. And a couple of fishermen were out there fishing, and this thing was floating in the lake. And it turned out that it was the corpse of a woman who was a murder victim, and her body had essentially turned to soap.
Turned to soap?
Yes. Saponification. A body turning to a soap-like substance it can occur in different environments, but if you have a low oxygen level, you have an alkali content, there's kind of an anaerobic bacteria effect, can basically, just like you make soap using fat, your body fat can turn to effectively a soap-like substance. So this disfigured her in the sense that by the time her body had popped to the surface, her facial features were not distinguishable. She didn't have any fingerprints, but they could tell that she had met a violent death and somebody had put her in the lake, but nobody knew who she was or how long she had been in the lake. This was a forensic mystery that the local coroner and others attempted to solve. They knew it was a woman. She had a dental plate, and they put kind of a, I don't know, it's not an APB, but they put something out saying, hey, if anybody finds a dental plate with this number on it or this ID mark on it, please let us know. And there was a dentist, I think in Montana, who recognized it and recognized the number, and he was able to put an identity on the victim. Her name was Hallie Illingworth, and she disappeared in 1937 and, reappeared in 1940.
In the lake.
In the lake. So this was both literally and figuratively a cold case. So, law enforcement proceeded to try to figure out what happened. She had lived in the area. She was a waitress at a tavern on the lake, which is now the Lake Crescent Lodge. But back in the day, it was a tavern. And she was in a relationship with a guy who was a beer truck driver. And apparently it was fairly well known that they had a fairly abusive relationship. A lot of drinking, a lot of beating. She suffered violence and abuse. And they basically found that she had disappeared around the same time he had moved away. Her family had not missed her. There was a belief that maybe she had moved to Bremerton or something, and they just had lost track of her. Nobody knew that she had been killed. And of course, now with that knowledge, her husband was suspect, and he had moved to California, but they were able to gather enough evidence that put him in the frame. They were able to get him back to the Northwest where he was tried and convicted of her murder.
What was the evidence that tied him?
Well, both the pattern of behavior, of this abusive behavior, the fact that he took off at a certain date, which coincided with when she disappeared, stopped showing up for work. And then one of the key pieces of evidence was that he had borrowed a length of hemp rope from someone, and it was exactly the kind of hemp rope that had been used to tie the blankets around the victim. So a guy was able to testify to this, and he said, yeah, and he never returned the hemp rope. I never got it back. And and so that was the thing that put the nail in his, well, not his coffin, but his
case.
Defense, yes. The trial took place during the first part of World War II, and of course the headlines on this particular case, people were following it. I mean, most of the newspapers are covering the war, but this was such a unique and interesting case as far as the solving a mystery, but also the soap factor. And that was what planted the seed for me, was because my father was a physician. He had been a surgeon and a medical illustrator. He was also a research pathologist, and he had done a residency in pathology. And that pursuit, he continued that work from home. So I grew up in a house where the basement was full of specimens of various kinds, human and animal, related to anatomy, related to pathologies of various kinds. So I was just fascinated by this at a very young age, but I didn't really follow any of the details.
Was the saponification a factor in the stories that were so sensational and printed in the newspaper? Is that what drew people to this story?
I think it was one of the elements of it. I mean, Lake Crescent has a reputation of kind of keeping its victims. I mean, there was a case some years ago where there was a car crash or some people went out for a drive and it turned out they went into Lake Crescent, but their car and their bodies weren't found for decades. But there definitely was fascination in the saponification. The fact that a body could turn essentially to a bar of soap, I think, was quite interesting to people.
Does this happen very often, saponification?
Yeah, it's not particularly a rare thing in certain areas.
It just needs the right conditions.
It needs the right conditions, but it can happen fairly quickly. You don't have to be in a lake for years for this to happen. It depends on soil conditions and water conditions. There was a body that was found in a lake in Switzerland that had come to the surface, was similar to Hallie in that it was a torso that was soap-like. And they found out that it was somebody who had gone into this lake in the late 18th century. So it had been preserved by the cold and then for whatever reason had come to the surface. There's a phenomenon called corpse wax, which is basically what we're talking about, adipocere. And it's this chemical process with the help of anaerobic bacteria that can turn fatty parts of a human body into a soap-like or wax-like substance. And this is found apparently fairly common in Germany, where every 20 or 30 years they'll dig up a graveyard so they can put new burials in. And in the right kind of soil, they find a fair number of people with this adipocere. It's called corpse wax. So, it's not unknown.
Well, I'll never think of soap on a rope in quite the same way.
Oh, my God.
You found another story of strange things happening to bodies almost a century before, and it involved a woman known as Mother Damnable.
Yeah.
Who was she?
So Mother Damnable, also known as Madame Damnable, but her name was Mary Ann Conklin. She was a very early resident of Seattle. So she was established here in the 1850s. She had apparently married a sea captain, had been abandoned in Port Townsend, and found her way to this, nascent settlement of Seattle. And she was a local character. I mean, she was probably the first, big, character with a capital C in the city. And she worked at a place called the Felker House. The Felker House was a hotel. It had been shipped out from the East Coast. It was like a prefab, put it together. So it was one of the few early buildings in Seattle that looked like something you'd see in New England. And she ran the place. And it had a reputation as, a place for drinking and partying. It was also public space was used there for courtrooms or meetings, and it was also
all-purpose.
Yes, well, and the upstairs was said to have been the Seattle's first bordello.
Oh,
so whether that's established fact or just the common story, but this is how she became Mother Damnable, and apparently she had a real temper. So in the mid-1850s, there was a war between indigenous people and settlers that occurred in Washington, what's now Washington.
Was that the battle for Seattle?
Well, it occurred in eastern Washington as well as parts of, Pierce County and other places. And, the settlers were up in arms building block houses and whatnot. And yes, the Battle of Seattle was an incident that occurred during this time where Native people were set out to attack the settlement in Seattle. They had gotten a warning, but they were worried about it. These things didn't happen suddenly, and they had asked for protection, and a Navy ship, the Decatur, anchored in Elliott Bay, and, was prepared with its cannons to defend the city if it came under attack. And while they were there, the crew went ashore for, various activities. And you can imagine a place like the Felker House might attract such things. Apparently, the sailors were banned from going there. There's probably a whole story about that relationship that I'm not aware of, because there was some hostility between the Navy personnel and Madame Damnable. And this is recorded. One of the officers on the Decatur talks about an attempt or multiple attempts to improve a road that went by the Felker House that they thought would help improve the defense of Seattle. And every time their crew came out to do work on this road, Marianne Conklin would come flying out of the Felker House with an apron full of stones and a couple of, vicious dogs, and would attack the sailors, throwing rocks, swearing, using she was notorious for being knowing every swear word in every language, apparently, and would chase these guys off. And she was fierce enough, that they fled, rather than confront her. So she had this reputation of being a, really tough, tough bulldog of a woman.
And not much into local improvement.
Apparently not.
Where was Felker House, by the way?
So it was basically down around what would be now sort of Jackson and First Avenue.
What happened to the Felker House?
Well, apparently it burned in the Great Fire of 1889, so it was right, in what's now Pioneer Square, right on the waterfront. And so many of those early structures that were the real Seattle up until 1889, they were wood and they burned. Anyway, so yeah, she was a figure in the city for some years and then died, and was buried in what's now Denny Park. But there was a city cemetery there where the hill was. So in the 1880s, they dug up all the graves in that cemetery, and they were transferred elsewhere, up to what's now Volunteer Park. And then some of them went to Lakeview Cemetery on Capitol Hill. So there's a story in the Seattle PI about a reporter went and talked to the guy in charge of the grave digging, and he tells a story to the reporter about what they found when they dug up Mother Damnable's grave.
What did they find?
Well, according to the newspaper account, and it's in quotations from the guy they interviewed, she was found to be in almost pristine condition, and they perceived her as having turned to stone. Her coffin was very heavy. It was as if, she had become petrified. They estimated that the coffin and her body weighed 400 pounds. So they somehow got this thing out of the hole in the ground and reburied her.
Maybe this was just because of her hard-edged personality?
Yeah, the hard life. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I mean, her whole story is fascinating. I wish we knew more details about her and her life and whatever traumas she went through. And, of course, but people didn't talk or write or leave extensive records about her, partly because of the business she was in. But I think that the likelihood of her actually having turned to stone or turned into something like marble is probably not entirely accurate, but I think it may be another example of saponification, that she was in ground conditions that caused the corpse wax or adipocere to cover her before she had deteriorated a great deal, so that she looked as if she was made out of marble. And in reading about this process, I learned that in some cases, depending on the soil conditions, clay can come in and adhere to the adipocere and kind of create a hard shell. And this might account for the heaviness of her coffin, as well as the stone-like appearance of Mother Damnable.
Is there a lot of clay in that part of town at Denny Park?
Well, I thought of one person to ask, and that's David Williams, local historian. He's also writes a lot about geology. Mm-hmm. And he did Too High and Too Steep, which is a fabulous book about all the regrades. And of course, you know, what's now Denny Park used to be part of a hill, and that has been regraded and flattened, so it doesn't look anything like it did even when it was a cemetery. And I asked him, you know, is there any evidence that there was clay in the soil there? And he found a documented description of some of the regrade work that was taking place on what had been the location of the graveyard, and it mentions that goes out of its way to mention a significant amount of blue clay. And of course, this is, you know, part of the glacial legacy here. So there's a pretty good evidence that there was probably clay in the soil at that place where she was buried. Now, whether my theory is correct, it's just crudely putting kind of two and two together, but it sounds like, you know, she probably was covered in corpse wax, and then this clay may have contributed to the look and weight that was noted by the gravedigger.
So it's still a form of saponification.
Right. Yes. I mean, another question would be, did she, you know, actually turn into stone? I think that's highly unlikely from what I've read. But there have been other claims of bodies having turned to stone after death. So,
well, if anybody would, it sounds like she could.
Yes, I suppose so.
Finally, we turn to what you've called a, quote, beachcombing horror. Disembodied feet showing up on beaches along the Salish Sea in British Columbia and in Washington. I remember a news article of a foot washing up on shore in British Columbia. And then I think I remember the very strange occurrence being described yet again not too long later.
A mystery washing up on the shores of British Columbia in Canada. A running shoe with a human foot inside.
Yeah, right. Well, there was a young girl from Washington State who found a human foot in a shoe on a beach in BC. And, you know, that was kind of beachcomber's nightmare type of thing. Yes, and then shortly thereafter in another part of BC, another foot, but it was a different foot and a different shoe showed up. I think I quoted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer as just saying, you know, finding one foot is, you know, a 1 in a million chance, but finding 2 feet, you know, this is like bizarre.
We begin tonight with a mystery unfolding on a BC beach. A human foot has once again been discovered.
So this is in the 2006, 2007. And then, of course, people are focusing on this. Every time a foot in a shoe gets discovered on a Washington or British Columbia beach, it's big news.
It is becoming all too common in BC. Another foot has washed up on shore, this time in Richmond.
The feet are among 6 dismembered ones washed ashore in British Columbia and Washington State.
Authorities say it is the 7th foot to wash up on the coast in the past 2 years. Another foot was found on the U.S. side in Washington State, bringing the total to 8.
Well, how many have been discovered?
Yeah, well, since 2006 or so, more than 20 feet have been found in the Salish Sea, and most of them in the sort of San Juan's, Strait of Juan de Fuca, North Puget Sound, and the British Columbia and Vancouver Island coast areas.
More in Canada than in Washington?
Yeah. And so, you know, naturally everybody's like, what the heck is going on?
Every time a case like this happens, it gets plenty of attention and sparks plenty of speculation.
Well, I remember reading the newspaper accounts. There were all sorts of conspiracy theories or crazy theories as to what was going on. Was there a serial killer loose?
Another popular theory in the beginning was that this was an intentional act. There was a vicious foot-severing criminal on the loose.
So what was going on?
Yeah, what appears to have been part of this phenomenon is that, it's common for bodies in saltwater particularly to disarticulate after a certain. So if a body sinks for whatever reason, crabs and other critters can nibble away at whatever's there, and often the weak spots are at the wrists or ankles or whatever. And so at a certain point, they come loose. And so once the foot becomes detached from the corpse and is in this shoe, apparently it can float to the surface, and then it's just another piece of, I call it foot flotsam. And that appears to be what happened. These weren't coming from people with one particular profile. They tended to match, and in some cases they were able to match with DNA to particular people who had fallen overboard or been jumped off a bridge or.
So these feet were identified to known people who were missing?
Not all of them, but yes, some of them were. Quite a few of them were drowning victims, and nothing that appeared to be criminal whatsoever.
But why this series of feet coming ashore now? I mean, it's not a phenomenon that has been reported in other times in history, as far as I know.
Yeah, well, there's certainly reports of people finding a foot in a shoe on a beach. It's not super rare, but having so many of them show up, that was the unusual thing. I mean, I've read accounts where there was a shipwreck off of Vancouver Island in the late 1800s where everybody was killed in the surf. And months later, parts were washing up on the beach, including feet in shoes. It appears that there are two major theories about what's going on here. One is that somewhere in the 2000 aughts, the design of sport shoes changed.
Oh.
And that shoes like Nike shoes and others had air pockets and had very light foam. So it appears that this was happening to corpses who happened to be wearing recent vintage sport shoes of various brands.
And they float.
So then the question is there some reason they keep floating up where they float up?
Yeah, that's the other question I had. We don't read about this happening in Asia or in Australia, or do we?
No, I haven't. So it appears to be both a phenomenon tied to shoe technology and tied to specific kind of tidal conditions in the Salish Sea. Part of it has to do with the flow of the Fraser River. Some of the bodies seem to have originated there. You also have tidal action happening in the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the San Juan Islands and North Puget Sound that can create a situation where things that go in there sort of stay there and circulate there. They're not going out to the ocean, or at least some larger percentage of them aren't going anywhere. So that's at least the kind of accepted theory of it.
Do you think Seattle and the Northwest has a reputation for macabre crimes and mysteries? We certainly have the atmosphere for it. There's a natural built-in noir setting. We're on the water. We're a seaport. We have lots of strangers come and go. And it just seems like the perfect milieu for a lot of strange stories to emanate.
Yeah, I think, you're talking about the waterways, you're talking about the deep forests. I think there was a time when criminals would come here because they thought they wouldn't get caught here. You could go out to the Olympic Peninsula and live and nobody would catch up to you. TV shows like Twin Peaks really played on that. Incredible atmospheric music, atmospheric cinematography, and connecting the mountains and the sea. Both can be kind of spooky places. Certainly, the maritime history here is lots of shipwrecks, lots of ghost stories, lots of strange stuff. And then, we'll never really get over the serial killer.
Well, we have a reputation.
Yes, we have a reputation, but there's serial killers lots of places we now know. And it's not just Ted Bundy and the Green River Killer. But the nature of what they were doing was they were using the Northwest environment, the Northwest beautiful natural environment that we love, as help in their crimes.
In what way?
Well, Gary Ridgway was killing women and dumping them in the Green River. Ted Bundy was using the access to the foothills of the Cascades as the best place he could put victims that people wouldn't find. And so the closeness with which these two urban killers were to this moody landscape, they were actually using it to hide their crimes or to commit their crimes. We mentioned D.B. Cooper earlier. This is, an internationally known crime with no solution. And the guy, if he escaped parachuting out of a plane into the woods and was never found. If you think about the UFO phenomenon, a pilot at Mount Rainier sees these flying saucers. I mean, they're just these stories, in addition to crime stories, these stories that just adhere to us as a place where weird stuff happens or weird stuff originates. Conspiracy kinds of things, phenomenon we can't explain. And that, the tennis shoe thing fits right into that, although there is a rational explanation for it. At first, it seemed like an extension of these other kinds of stories where something is happening, it's totally bizarre, it's happening in the Pacific Northwest. Why? There are people who will never give up on D.B. Cooper. There are people who never will give up on UFOs. There are people who won't believe whatever the facts are or the evidence is for the floating feet. It just provides this kind of ongoing fodder that we seem to be a very fertile part of the world in terms of fostering this kind of thing.
Thanks for listening to Mossback. The video series is now in its 10th season. If you'd like to see all the episodes from this or any season of Mossback's Northwest, you can find them at cascadepbs.org. This episode of Mossback was produced by Sarah Bernard. Our story editor and executive producer is Sarah Menzies. You can subscribe to the Mossback podcast wherever you listen, and whatever platform you're listening on, please review us. We'd love to know what you think of the show. And check out the show notes if you'd like to get in touch. Also, if you'd like to support the work we do, join the members who make Mossback's Northwest possible. Your donation will help fund the Cascade PBS lineup of podcasts, the video docuseries we stream every week, and the in-depth reporting we deliver every day. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive great member benefits, including Cascade PBS Passport, with extended access to an on-demand library of local and PBS favorites. And being a member means you can sign up for the exclusive weekly Mossback Den newsletter from Knut Berger, where he offers greater insight into his latest historical discoveries. Go to cascadepbs.org/membership to sign up today. Mossback is a product of Cascade PBS. I'm Stephen Hegg. We'll be back soon with another episode.